I'm happy today to be talking to Tony Sampson about his book, The Assemblage Brain, Sense Making in Neuroculture. And Tony, I thought maybe we could start with a big picture question, which is when you think about the future of human computer interaction, which is really sort of what your book is about, what are you most excited about on a personal level, and what are you most worried about?
I would say that, as far as the things that I'm looking forward to, um, there's immense potential, isn't there, with human-computer interaction. It's not all doom and gloom. There's some interesting stuff this morning on the British TV about, addiction, and it's a nebulous term, isn't it? Addiction. We really would have to kind of think through very carefully the kind of the amount of people who are going to be impacted by that, and the amount of people who really enjoy using computers, like you and me at the moment, communicating across distance. It's great.
Mm-hmm.
But the book itself is a bit of a cautionary tale for when things like that might go wrong. And a lot of my work, particularly more recent work, in fact, around things like addiction, the idea of being hooked, and the way that design works to hook people using apps, computer games. I would say that's probably the bleaker picture. So that's my focus with design, and that's why I'm interested in the design of computing and computer interaction.
As I was reading it, some of the time I was thinking, wow, the future, the way the technology has changed in the last 10, 20 years has been really incredible. But then I also started to really worry, especially, the things that you mentioned about the way that we kind of lose our ability to navigate, especially in less conscious ways that we don't even realize. I guess I'm curious, you spend a lot of time looking at this. You spend a lot of time analyzing these sort of worst case scenarios or just problems that may occur. How do you feel about technology in general? I think the book feels very sort of objective, and I couldn't get a good sense of whether or not you are a sort of optimist or pessimist, because the book has both aspects. I'm wondering how you see yourself.
No, really, I would have thought most people say it's very dystopian. I'd be interested to push you a little bit on finding out where you think I'm optimistic, but I tend to write in a very kind of dystopian kind of way. I'm stuck to try and think where the optimism is there, but
I guess what I was thinking though is that I assume you're pretty much spending your life dedicated to these kinds of questions, which I can't imagine somebody doing if they think it's going in the wrong direction and there's no hope. So I feel like just the very fact that you are so involved in these debates makes me think that you think that there's a brighter future, maybe, that you're contributing to pushing us in that direction. I don't know, maybe that's just me.
Yeah, well, there's an ethical kind of move, isn't there? But I must say, criticising my own work, I'm often stuck to come up with solutions to some of the problems. But my work is kind of a mixture of focusing on technology, which is kind of like my bread and butter work at university, and B, this kind of deep interest in philosophy and particularly ontology. And so really, I look at the kind of ontological facets of being online and communicating through new technology, and a lot of conclusions I come up with, and particularly drawing on examples, is that it is more dystopian than utopian.
Well, and you actually approach it through this idea of dystopia, and I was wondering, I mean, of all the things that you could use, you do return a lot to like Brave New World and these kinds of dystopian fictions. What do those give you? Why do you keep returning, or why do you use these fictional works? What do they help you see, or what do they help you think through?
Okay, I was interested because there was a debate going on in the British press. I presume similar debates might have occurred over there as well, which post Brexit, post Trump, there was debate around whether we're in Brave New World or whether we're in 1984. Whether this is Orwellian or Huxley. And I was really interested in reading that because in my own area, which is broadly speaking kind of new materialism, affect theory, I was trying to think which one resonated more with that account. And I started reading, going back to school, A-level texts, really looking at Huxley and Orwell. And Huxley is a deeply affect theory orientated dystopian. compared to the kind of more language-driven, structuralist kind of 1984, with all its focus on, subverting language, etc. And those were sort of debates which were coming through in the press. And of course, Neil Postman did a very similar job a long time ago. So what I try to do is revisit that and think through Huxley's affective appeals to control and power. And I don't know how deep you want to get here, but one of the actual other driving forces behind it, of course, is Deleuze's Control Society, which is quite famously influenced by William Burroughs. And I didn't want to just cover that kind of usual ground around Burroughs, so I thought I'd introduce the other kind of dystopias to kind of mix it up a little bit.
No, I find it really interesting because I think a lot of this stuff I read that relates to this kind of field is very much sort of technology and almost engineering driven about, what's possible, what are people doing, what are the advances and stuff like that. And so to go from that, which is very sort of grounded in sort of scientific approach, and then to think about it sort of more of a literary thing of Huxley and Orwell and others, I found that interesting, especially because a lot of the stuff that you're referring to in terms of technology is very much grounded in a sort of scientific approach. And so to refer back to something that is, fictional, even though it's obviously related and important in how we view our world, I found that to be interesting in somebody doing research on talking about brain scanning and the kind of human-computer interfaces and interactions that we use. It was interesting to hear a sort of literary, almost a literary analysis in a way.
Sure, yeah. Although, some of my stuff is quite technical and scientific. I take a lot from HCI. I can't remember it's chapter 1 or 2 or 3, sorry. But what I wanted to do really is sort of slip in between these kind of worlds. So at one point you had a very kind of scientific analysis of, say, EEG, or different types of neuropharmaceuticals, which I kind of got stuck into quite a lot of detail. But then to drift out and is it fabulation they call it when you start thinking through fiction as a way to analyze what's really going on? The sort of stuff that Stephen Shaviro does in Discognition.
Yeah. No, and I found that really interesting. It actually made me wonder because we haven't met. I've just contacted you, and after reading your book, I was wondering who you like to hang out with in terms of associations or conferences and stuff like that. Because just based on this book, I was thinking, I can only imagine you at a sort of neuroscience conference or something dealing with neurotechnology, cognition, and pulling out Deleuze and critical theory. And I can't imagine that necessarily going that well, or a lot of people being conversant. At the same time, though, if you were at a cultural studies or critical theory conference and dealing with such scientific and neurological and cognitive science, I can't imagine a lot of people would be able to follow you. So I was wondering how you position yourself in different academic circles.
Well, I suppose the answer to that, Chris, is I don't hang around with anybody for those reasons. Well, no, the area I'm involved in really are people who have embraced technology in a big way, and they're not neuroscientists or engineers. I think you're spot on there. I mean, they would struggle to understand a lot of the language I'm using. I've always been interested, and one of the people who reviewed the books through Minnesota was a neuroscientist, and actually he was quite positive about certain aspects of it. You always risk there that they're going to dig into some sort of detail. And, I'm always with Deleuze in that sense. You can do a kind of non-scientific reading of science and get away with it. After all, there's a lot of scientists doing philosophy in pretty ropey ways as well. So, we need confidence to steer forward with that and not ignore it. But, I don't think on the other side, that kind of critical theory, philosophy, particularly around affect theory, people embrace technology and science all the time. I don't know if you're familiar with, for example, Matt Fuller and software studies here. They're really interested in working with and working around code, talking about technology. There are other people who work with technologists to produce work which is critical in terms of design. So it's not so alien to me, that side. Mm-hmm. But I've had some difficult guest talks where I've either been speaking to people who are more scientifically minded and they have a certain set of issues around my work. And, of course, I've bumped into those sort of cultural studies types who are quite alien to having any kind of scientific ideas within the humanities. But that's a challenge anyway, isn't it?
Yeah, well, and I think that you're doing exactly what good researchers should be, which is engaging in multiple fields so that you can kind of come up with something unique and insightful using one against the other or with the other.
Sure, and of course the book begins with this idea around the interference, which is something I've been doing a lot more on recently because I don't know about in the States, but a big buzzword here is getting out of our silos, becoming more interdisciplinary, more cross-disciplinary. That's where the innovation in the universities seems to be, we're told. Mm-hmm. So the whole idea of kind of dealing with the interference between disciplines and going back to Deleuze and Guattari's what is philosophy really kick-started all that. In fact, it's funny you should mention it. The book itself was inspired really by some criticism I had from a particular kind of theorist, social theorist, I suppose, who criticised my use of the mirror neuron to describe one way in which we might think about the role of imitation in communication. It was a very brief kind of mention, and perhaps the criticism had a good point to it, but in a way, the whole of that kind of now I'm going to kind of address this thing about mirror neurons and spin up the whole kind of neurological side of my research. That's really where it all began. So these ideas of crossing and interfering between disciplines is really important to the book.
Yeah, no, and I think like I said, you're a good example of this because the fear, I guess, and clearly what I've read in not so great work is people who really don't understand science and want to just throw in a few scientific buzzwords. Bérubé actually writes a good analysis of this, Michael Bérubé, about how there is probably a good reason why certain people shouldn't, or at least don't do it well enough, to go from critical cultural studies and to throw in some scientific things that don't really make so much sense. And like you said, there are scientists who throw in a philosophical term or degrade maybe a philosophical term, and the engagement really isn't there, and that's when these things fall apart. And I guess that's always the fear, is that reading something that engages in these two, pretty difficult disciplines to enter and to really understand, there's a lot of room for, I guess, sort of one-sidedness, but that makes me wonder, how do you approach critical interference as a method? Like, if you were going to explain or give tips to somebody who wanted to employ this method, how do you go about doing it?
Well, yeah, I've been writing about that a lot more. Just to say, thanks for saying that about the engaging with science. And I grasp exactly what you mean about some works that kind of just throw in an odd technical term. I'm glad you think it works. I must say that I was driven purely by this idea that if you look, especially around a lot of neuroscientific work, there is an attack on philosophy going on. From inside neuroscience, and this idea that we can do a kind of non-scientific reading of science. I mean, I'm not a scientist, I'm not an engineer, my mind doesn't work like that, but it doesn't stop me getting involved in the detail the best I possibly can, and I really appreciate you picking up on that point.
Yeah, no, definitely.
I think there is a bit of a kind of struggle going on in terms of interferences. I've been writing about it in another article just submitted for a book. It's not going to come out for probably another while. But my idea there is, well, okay, you can start mixing up things and looking at the kind of mixtures, disciplinary mixtures. But what is interesting about Deleuze and Guattari's book is they were really cautious about doing that. So one of the points I make there is, well, why? Why were they cautious? They were always looked upon as what Stengers calls the kind of philosophers of mixture. Everything could mix. So why, in their kind of swan song, did they suddenly say, well, hang on, there are discrete disciplines and they can only mix within kind of certain ways. There are different interferences, as you might recall if you read the book. But why is this tension? Why? And of course, one of the overriding problems we face today is keeping criticality there. And I'm really interested in when things do mix, i.e. when the cultural theorist or artist does work with the scientist or the engineer, to what extent can criticality survive in that relationship, in that mixture? And I think there's an element of threat in there. There's an element of dressing up particular approaches that you might want to put forward, say, for funding, for research, which have an inbuilt criticality, but as soon as you mix with another discipline, say engineering or science, that might become watered down by necessity to get the money, for example. So there's some really interesting debates around that, which go beyond just the idea of kind of mixing disciplines and doing a bit of science in cultural theory.
I'm curious also, I guess, how do you balance looking into these things from, well, like you said, a sort of pessimistic or dystopian framework? How do you balance that with, do you try to be somewhat objective as you're looking at this, or do you try to look at it from a particular lens, Deleuze or Marx or whomever, when you're approaching sort of critical issues, right? How do you approach it, and is there an attempt to sort of be open-minded?
You probably have to explain a little bit about my background.
Mm-hmm.
I began as a kind of Marxist media theorist, really. So as far as I could tell at the time, was most accounts of technology were kind of rosy garden kind of technologies and approaches. So everything was presented to you before you kind of started reading this material in a very sort of positive light. I wrote or co-edited a book with Jussi Parikka a while ago called The Spam Book, and we thought at the time that was one of the first kind of books, one of the unique things about it, to kind of present the antithesis of Bill Gates' road ahead, because everything was how wonderful this thing's going to be, how it's going to roll out, how we're going to all become connected, and of course there's a lot of ugly weed-like things going on in the background that needed some light shed on. So, I started writing around issues around computer viruses. So I suppose I've always had this kind of tendency to look at the kind of more, we called it the dark side, not because we thought it was dark as it, in some kind of metaphorical sense, but literally it was dark because nobody bothered actually shining a light on it. So, that was a transition from looking at things from a very critical Marxist point of view, transitioning into what we broadly call now, digital culture, informed by what I broadly call kind of new materialist affect theory approach. But I'd like to think that I am open, but I must admit that one criticism I'd have of myself, and I'm sure other people who would read the book and say the same thing, is that it is overridingly dystopian.
Yeah, well, and I think that that's been something that I've noticed in the last, decade or probably more, depending on what kind of framework you're using. But yeah, there's definitely the Bill Gates rosy approach of, the greatness that we will be able to achieve. And this is obviously for various reasons, commercial reasons, the kind of selling point of Apple and Google and these kinds of companies is that, every year it's getting better. We're going into a better future. And there was definitely a lack of sort of critical insight until that kind of stuff did start to appear. And then I felt like there was just a barrage of anytime you hear about technology, you're going to hear about the world ending or something like that. And so I find it hard myself to know where is a sort of appropriate way of approaching something.
It's a matter of perspective, though, isn't it? Because if obviously in your position you're reading a lot more material that a lot of other people aren't getting access to, which you've got quite a privileged position there. When I started out, I was quite inexperienced in terms of reading about technology. This talk about my first degree, and once I was introduced to criticality through Marxist media theory, it opened up a kind of whole different world to me. And although I feel very similar to you that everything's pretty down, and especially with the sort of looking, say, Donald Trump's tweets, for example, the whole technology seems very bleak. But there are a lot of people out there who don't see it like that. So I suppose I try and do things that are not just academic books, but filter stuff out through other ways, other channels, saying pretty much the same kind of message. Really, we do quite a lot of public engagement events in where I live in Essex, which is just outside London, and you'd be surprised that people aren't getting the same kind of negative messages that you're being kind of subsumed in. So I think it's still, a real need to keep on pumping out some of that stuff.
No, and that's, I guess, one of the challenges is talking to different communities and speaking within different communities because, well, like you and your work, right, I'm sure there are a lot of people in neuroscience in particular who are really optimistic, and the answer, you sort of say in your book, right, the answer to everything from some people's perspective is, more neuroscience or potentially more invasive technology and that kind of thing, whereas there's definitely a need for a counterbalance to those arguments.
Yeah.
It reminds me, though, of an experience I had. So I teach, among other things, film theory class, and I've taught it for a few years now. And the first year I taught it, I showed this fMRI that they are doing on people who were watching, I believe it was Avatar at the time, James Cameron's Avatar. And so they're doing these fMRI tests on people to make sure that they're engaging them so thoroughly that, I don't know, dopamine levels are opening up and that they're really hitting these centers of the brain that they want, so that they create as much significance in terms of their what they're perceiving as possible. And so they'll do a bunch of versions. I'm sure you're aware of this kind of thing, right? They do a bunch of versions of trailer, for example. They watch people's brains in real time and see which ones are the most effective, and then they pump those out into the commercials and TV and stuff like that. And so when I showed my students this a few years ago, I think there was what I would expect, which was kind of concern and feeling of sort of invasiveness and these kinds of things. Whereas this last term, I showed this same kind of video, and people didn't really seem worried about it. Like the students were like, yeah, that's just a natural progression of advertising, and I don't particularly mind. And that I would assume that they're doing this kind of thing, which to me was really surprising. And I'm just wondering how you find that generally people are responding to this kind of thing. And it made me step back for a second and think, like, am I reading too much critical stuff and that I'm overly worried and naturally approaching this as this is a bad thing? Or are these students, as representatives of a sort of bit younger generation, are they being exposed too much to this where it's just become another thing that they're dealing with, that it is a non-issue for them, but perhaps should be, I guess.
Sure, yeah.
This is where I'm getting at for this this approach, right? I'm wondering, am I sort of too negative, or are we too negative? How do we know that this is something we should worry about, and how do you explain that to someone who's just like, yeah, this is just another privacy agreement that I'll have to click on to use the app?
Yeah, in a real practical way. I work with design students a lot in my kind of day job. And I've shown very similar films, with different like EEG or fMRI being used to look at films, or using things like eye tracking to look at people's attention. And I think I've noticed a very similar shift to you, from people being kind of concerned about the invasiveness of it to not being really that concerned. And actually, perhaps, and this isn't just students either, this is, other designers, a large amount of excitement about it as well, what it can do. I suppose in a more sober way, just to kind of turn the conversation around a little bit, what I'm interested in is actually the kind of, the basis of this stuff. What does it actually mean? And I don't know whether you've looked in the book at all about the picture of the mouse, where he's having his... he or she having their whiskers stimulated, and then that would then correspond to an individual neuron. And so this is kind of a kick-starting of the idea, well, if you could map up some kind of sensation, external sensation, to a particular neuron, you can start to read the brain. A lot of these things you're describing are, if one part of the brain is kind of lit up, then people are really excited by this, and their attention is focused on this particular film you're showing. But there's a long journey really between that kind of sensational level, that kind of stimulation of the whisker, and a particular part of the brain which might light up in these tests, to the idea of concepts and people actually thinking up ideas. So I think a lot of the stuff I try to do is firstly showing, look, here is this stuff, isn't it invasive? And we try and discuss the ethics of that with students. And you meet this kind of panoply of either disinterest, fear and paranoia, right the way around to kind of excitement. And isn't this fantastic? But the one I want to really get across to them is just, how valid is this stuff? Is it really as scary as you might think? What is the kind of science behind it? And a lot of the times the science is more unstable than you're led to believe. So I just think there's an interesting dimension that quite often the science claims to be doing one thing, but in fact, a lot of the time it's just marketing within itself in a way.
Yeah, and it has been interesting to see how often, I wasn't really aware until I read this book, how often people are claiming to do neuro stuff. So basically you just put neuro in front of things, and then you get neuro design and neuro this and neuro that, and in many cases it's not necessarily that different, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, I've been doing a lot of work lately around the influence of Damasio, it's sort of writ large amongst all kinds of different disciplines. I'm just comparing Catherine Howe's new book with, the kind of tendency in affect theory to use Antonio Damasio's neuroscience. And really, there's just so many different readings of it and so many different interpretations that it becomes very difficult to tell where the original started and then what it spins out to. And that's in in our kind of work. I think once you get the marketing, some of the seminars I went to years ago to listen about brains, when I was doing the research into the book, was atrocious. I mean, it really was very light touch neuroscience, but with a lot of kind of hype and promises to clients that we're going to kind of tap into something that your clients won't tell you because the brain never lies, that sort of rhetoric. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting to kind of approach it from all different ways. Look at the science very closely, run through fictional dystopian accounts which kind of tell a future where if this stuff does work, then this is what it could be like. But also, keep a firm kind of cynicism in place when listening to the kind of hype.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely important and something that sometimes we just don't have time to really look into. Which, with your stuff, for example, a lot of it I wasn't really aware of, especially with the neuroscience aspect. But the way that you combine it, I thought was really interesting and helpful for me, for someone who's not that aware of the neuroscience that's going on and the discourses that are going on in relation to it.
Sure, yeah. I hope you noticed that part of it because, I did read quite a lot of neuroscientific theory. There's a whole different world there opening up, and the debates within neuroscience itself are absolutely amazing. So, it is a book that tries to, mix itself to try and get in there. So I'm glad you picked up on that anyway.
Well, and luckily, I guess for me, that I had not a lot of idea about the neuroscience behind it, but I was familiar and I had read the other stuff, Deleuze and other things, Foucault and the people you mentioned. So I could follow along with that, which I found really helpful because, like I said, a lot of the time I can read other accounts of Foucault or Deleuze, but the information won't be as informative in relation to whatever it's being applied to. So in this case, neuroscience. What if anything, I guess, would you say that we're moving towards, considering, you talk in the book about Foucault's discipline and the control society of Deleuze? Would you say that there is some kind of change beyond the control society, or would you say that it's sort of simply Deleuze's ideas coming to fruition in a sense?
Yeah, well, to some extent. So I don't like answering questions, Chris, where people say, "Do you know what's coming?" I've got to say I haven't got a clue. But all I can say is that for the work I've been doing, I'm more and more convinced that we need to take this stuff seriously. So there's an air of cynicism and there's an air of hype, and we need to be cautious, and particularly when we start using lots of different sources to draw into our work, and then say, well, look, this is what's going to happen. But one of the things that the control society does, it talks about people giving up themselves to power. Power is kind of invisible. It's an acquiescence, isn't it, to sort of power. So on one side, you've got that kind of dominating threat, but you've also got this thing where people welcome being controlled in that way. And that to me is dangerous, and that to me is where we start operating in a kind of neurological area that can probably learn something from neuroscience, can probably learn something from the ideas around neurochemicals, can probably learn something from brain imaging. But we have to be very cautious. But yeah, I mean, the whole book is looking at how the control society is spinning out in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, actually, reading this made me go back to Deleuze, which I'd read before, but then seeing it in this light, I had to look at it again, and it was, I mean, it's alarming, and at the same time, so I feel like I'm learning things that are valuable, and I wouldn't want to not know, even though there's this kind of idea of ignorance being bliss, and so if I didn't know that all these invasive things were happening, I wouldn't be as worried about it. But I am glad that I know about some of the invasive and problematic ways that people are using or marketing or trying to sort of suck our energies or mental energies so that we focus on this product or this thing, as opposed to, I guess, thinking for ourselves or thinking about things that are not put into our heads in various ways that we don't necessarily understand. I mean, if you had any advice, and I know you said you don't necessarily have a lot of solutions as you're looking at this stuff, but if you had to do or change something about the way the average person works and behaves, especially in order to sort of avoid this complete control society. I know there's no outside of power if you follow that line of thinking.
Yeah, sure.
But there is resistances. What would you do, or what would you recommend to people to resist this kind of giving over our brains and our thoughts to power?
Sure. Okay. Well, as I said initially, we started writing around things like computer viruses and looking for alternative ways of doing computing. That didn't take off very well. But because I focus more on affect theory, I think probably the thing that resonates with me most about some sort of advice for people is around Teresa Brenham's idea of the education of the senses. So a lot of the reason why I think people become controlled by these things without really knowing that they're being controlled, why they become hooked, why they become addicted, why they become compulsive. Their attention is drawn all the time to things, probably without them mostly realizing that in a very conscious way. Mm-hmm. Is because of the way that they're affected. So, and it seems to me that there's a lack of awareness, not just about how you think rationally about things, but how things affect you, how your senses are so important to your kind of day-to-day existence. And I don't know if you've ever read Teresa Brenham's Transmission of Effect, but there's some really nice things in there about how we might go about educating our senses to become more aware of ourselves outside of those kind of rational cognitive models that we're very familiar with. So it sounds a bit crazy, but as I said, I work a lot with design students, and I do a lot of work on emotional design, affective computing, talking about the kind of change between the rational kind of model of computing, the IBM model, to what we've got now with Mac, the whole kind of internet kind of age, which to me involves a lot more of a kind of sensual experiences than that kind of old model of rational computing. And it gets through to people in some interesting ways. I think people like to talk about their senses as well as their kind of cognitive psychology, and I think they start understanding and seeing things in very different ways, or not just seeing things, experiencing things in very different ways, feeling things in very different ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely a turn in the last decade or so. That obviously the effective turn, if you want to call it that, is opening up lines for that. That's the book you mentioned. I need to check that out. Well, you say in the book, which resonated with me, that free, unmediated brain time is in decline. And that's something that, I mean, I wasn't using those words, but just talking to friends a few days ago, we seemed to come to that conclusion, basically, that one of my friends who teaches in education, she was doing this project or whatever that involved just writing down what she was doing, I think every 15 minutes or something on certain days, to get a sense of how she spends her time. And what she realized was that she doesn't do the same thing for more than about 15 minutes. So she's always moving from either one crisis to another in the school or in whatever. But there's not, what she noticed, I guess, in this project was that she doesn't have a lot of time to just like sit and think or to work on something for an extended period of time. And I'm wondering, especially after reading the things that you mentioned here, where if anywhere do you find or might you find free unmediated brain time? And I guess how would you know is my concern after reading your book, because it seems like there are a lot of invasive things that I didn't even know were invasive. And so, for instance, desires for certain things or the ability to want or to concentrate or to do these things, where, if anywhere, can we get free unmediated brain time so that we can try to, I guess, find more of this space?
Well, okay. I think it's probably virtually impossible for most people. I'm in a lucky position because I'm not that young, and I managed to refuse to have a mobile phone. I've never had a mobile phone. It's not that I don't use digital technology. I use laptops and tablets, and I'm on them far too much. But I do have periods of time, i.e. when I get onto a train where I don't have a mobile phone to look at. So I can sit there in a train carriage, look out the window, and of course there's some sort of mediation going on there, but it's free from the kind of mediation which seems to consume most of us most of the time. So I'm a kind of an experiment on how you can do that. I think there's a growing interest in that kind of thing. I was involved in a seminar recently, a launch of a book dedicated to the idea of internet and digital addiction. And you'd be surprised the kind of things that are going on. Boot camps where people can detox from digital lives, and some really interesting artworks which are kind of engaging with that. When you talk to people, they're aware that these things are not glorious. They're not the road ahead. There are a great deal of anxieties. I've got fairly young kids who have grown up with this stuff. And it's really interesting to hear their kind of modes of resistance, actually. I mean, a lot of them, work within these systems. They don't do what I do and kind of step out and, Luddite kind of, neo-Luddite kind of position that I've managed to take. But they work within and they find ways of resisting within these systems. One of the interesting things we do with students at UEL is we go through a design process suggested in the book Hooked, which I don't know if you're familiar with that at all. Mm-hmm. But it is a really interesting, book, which apparently is very popular in Silicon Valley, and it tells you, how to use a quite crude behaviourist technique, I suppose, to get people to use your apps in a more compulsive way. There's the sort of idea around design and addiction is nothing new. But there was quite a lot of publicity recently in the UK. The Guardian published an article where a number of high-profile Silicon Valley types involved in Facebook, one of them was involved in designing the like button, of kind of themselves wanting to step away from these things and cut that particular compulsive side of digitality out of their lives. So, although I think it's, fairly impossible to escape entirely, there are modes. Maybe this is the optimism that you were looking for. There are ways to escape for a while.
That's definitely something that, unplugging is something that's become more and more popular as a way of escaping this thing, and of just gaining a little bit of insight or time, which I think is getting harder for people in general, because I know that even me and my partner, we were talking about how difficult it is to just sit and read without checking an email or without doing whatever.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so, it's almost like practice or mindfulness, I know, is another thing that's becoming more and more popular in circles that it wasn't before, because we're realizing how important that is. But actually, let's go back to this idea of optimism for a second. So I'm curious if you've thought about this, or if you have any insights now. if there is such a possibility of these dystopian futures, and if technology is becoming more invasive and problematic, why do you dedicate so much time to thinking about it and to engaging with it? I feel like there is some kind of, at least I was picking up some kind of hidden optimism in just the very fact that you're so engaged in these debates. But I'm curious, why would you say you do this as opposed to, I mean, if it is all dystopian, I personally would try to avoid it and not think about it, or to try to, I guess, focus my attention elsewhere. But the fact that you're focusing so much attention on this, to me, speaks to some kind of optimism. I'm wondering why do you do it? Why do you focus so much on it?
On technology itself, or
yeah, on technology and thinking through these possible scenarios that obviously in many cases we would want to avoid, but at the same time, I guess, what's the driving force behind this research?
Well, okay, I've worked with technology for a number of years. So I've worked with students who code or design technology around particularly apps these days, and whatever kind of Internet of Things type technologies that they're interested in. And so I've always been kind of there with technology, working with technology. So my remit in the last kind of probably decade has been to try and think of some way in which we can add some context to that. So rather than just teaching people just how to code or just how to design, is how can we add some context? So it's not really a matter of me deciding to do a particular kind of thing more than it is me having to think of ways in which to develop context around these things. My approach to design students and technology students is just to say, hey, have you ever thought about this? Have you ever thought about this? Different ways of thinking about your involvement in technology. So I don't really teach dystopian media theory to design students. All I do is really, as part of a process of teaching them around maybe a particular kind of design technique, is to just bolt on the end some sort of ethical kind of idea around that. I've got to be really honest with you here. That's really how I've developed the books, because that's just span out into more deeper kind of thinking and deeper ideas about that. The fact that it comes around and interests someone like yourself, which is great, is kind of in a way a little bit accidental in that sense. There is no plan in that sense.
Yeah.
But I mean, so I've always worked in a very kind of optimistic environment, in fact, around technology. So it gets back to my point I said to you originally, that out there in the world outside cultural studies, perhaps, there is a lot of optimism around technology, or a lot of, you might call it blind optimism. You might say a lot of it's justified. A lot of people love this stuff and enjoy it, don't they? Mm-hmm. I suppose my big question to them is, well, okay, you enjoy it, you love it, but have you ever thought about, some other aspects of it? It's no deeper than that, really.
Well, I mean, I think that's a good enough reason.
Yeah, I've got to think that, I've got to say rather that there are lots of contradictions in what I do. Just on a personal level, I'm a bit of a kind of a strange attitude towards technology at home. This not having a mobile phone is quite unusual, and a lot of people remark about it being very unusual. Mm. But with my kids, we tend to sort of regulate, or try to regulate, at least some of their consumption. But I mean, I notice contradictions in my own existence there, because I'll be sitting in front of a television telling them to get their nose out of their mobile phone.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they're the first ones to point out that, Dad, you're watching TV, telling us to stop doing this. So I suppose, all the dystopian kind of viewpoint I've got of it is informed very much by the context in which I find myself in terms of who I am, the age I am, and my experiences.
It reminds me, actually, I don't know if this is a sort of urban legend or if it's accurate, but I did hear that Marshall McLuhan, who is famous for being on the edge of technology at the time and for really engaging in these new ways of thinking and doing things, was at the same time very much adamant that his kids shouldn't be watching TV. He banned his kids from watching TV.
That's brilliant.
Again,
let's hope that
I'm not sure how accurate that is, but it is funny to think.
Let's hope that's true.
Yeah.
Well, you can see it probably, can't you?
Yeah.
Because you say, I mean, everyone sort of says, McLuhan's a kind of rosy garden kind of technologies, but as you know, being Canadian, he's not, is he, at all?
Yeah.
He had a lot of negative things to say. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, well,
I love McLuhan.
He's great. And I mean, talking about contradictions, I think he said something like, "I don't agree with half of the things I say." So he's definitely a contradiction that makes him amenable to, I guess, people who are very optimistic about technology and can take him as, the father of the internet or whatever, and then others who are very pessimistic about technology and they can still use him. But I guess
I'll just expand on that. I don't think there's anything wrong with being contradictory. I think writing within your own kind of paradoxes and trying to understand them is part of the process. That's to me what kind of theoretical exploration philosophy should be about. I'm quite happy sometimes to start an article where I'm just arguing against myself for a while. It takes ages to write the thing because obviously no one wants to read that particularly. But that's where you kind of end up where you are by pitching these two things against themselves.
Yeah, well, and you talk about that in the book, and maybe
of course, you
can say a little bit more about these contradictions. I guess as I'm hearing you and rethinking that part of the book, I'm curious, how do you know a good or a useful contradiction that you can explore intellectually and that you can work with, like you're speaking about, versus a contradiction in that like I'm in the U.S. and the U.S. is a contradiction, of course, in many ways as a country that I'm always amazed how driving down the highway going north during the holidays, I would see signs for Jesus Saves and for these kinds of things, and immediately under it would be basically stuff about buying guns. Or I would see things that are, very sort of wholesome Christian values or whatever, and then the next sign would be for a Hooters or for a restaurant that's, basically about objectifying women.
Yeah, right.
And so this sort of Puritan value and this non-Puritan value. I mean, to me, I see the potential for contradictions to be really useful and interesting and engaging, but then I also see contradictions in the sense that they're not very useful, or they're just they're leading to problems, I guess, in terms of what we value or what decisions we make. How do you know a sort of good contradiction, or what do you look for in a contradiction that is helpful to you versus something that is simply, just not well thought out?
Right. Okay. That's interesting. I suppose to think of things as being solved by the solving of contradiction as being well thought out is probably the wrong way to start. Rather look back to think about why are things contradicting in the first place, and work within the contradiction more than just trying to solve it. I mean, you're never going to solve the issue around gun crime and puritanical religion, are you? They almost seem contradictory, but from my experience, they do go hand in hand. Surely North America is not the only paradoxical country. Every country is going to have some sort of paradox of that kind.
Yeah, yeah.
But just to get back a little bit, maybe talk a little bit more about our disciplines. One of the things I've been thinking about writing, and I've just done some writing on it, is taking a kind of ambivalence or an ambivalent position. So that maybe is slightly different to the kind of the paradoxical. Mm-hmm. Attacking things that you kind of have two opinions about at the same time. So, for instance, going back to the kind of interdisciplinary mixture, I thought it was interesting in the sense that interdisciplinary mixture is very kind of creative, and we all know that once disciplines do kind of break down, and there's a certain amount of novelty which will emerge from there. But again, as I was saying earlier, there's this sort of erosion of criticality as well. So in ways, you've got the same thing about almost like the religion and gun crime moving. They're moving together with each other. You're trying to retain the criticality, and you're also trying to retain a kind of emergence of novelty. So maybe just riding that kind of ambivalent wave, traveling through a problem in that way, rather than just trying to solve a problem by negation or some sort of closing down of a contradiction.
Yeah, and I guess that's a natural tendency, is to want to solve a problem, which I know I always I try to stop myself in some cases from approaching certain situations in that way. But then, just out of curiosity, how do you write a book or how do you write an article while being ambivalent?
You write about ambivalence. So I did. You just reminded me. Even in this book, I did a lot of stuff on remaining open to contradiction and paradox. I can't remember what context I did it with in the book. It's quite a while since I did that, but it's always been a trade. It's not just my work, I've been influenced by others around that. Eventually you probably have to come down and say something in the end around a conclusion. But to me, the conclusion is always just opening up to the next article you're going to write. So there's a continual flow between things. But I think we go back to what we said originally here, that although I might have a very dystopian point of view, I work in an environment where there's a lot of utopia mixed in with that. So I'm just trying to negotiate my way through that.
Yeah,
the best I can.
No, and it's interesting. That I think makes a lot of sense, especially for people involved in technology, because there are those two extreme ways of looking at these things, right? Utopian and dystopian. And in reality, I think a lot of the things fall somewhere in the middle, and that's where we need to engage.
Yeah. Or you say, getting some balance back in, some nuance. So, rather than it being one extreme or the other extreme, maybe the role of people like you and me, and the kind of theory thing is to just introduce balance, just roll things out. So
well, I guess one of my final questions for you is, where do you see your research going? What are some of the questions that have piqued your interest in the last little while that you hope to pursue further?
Well, okay, I'm planning to write. I've been a bit busy of late with various other projects, but I want to write a book around experience. You would have noticed in the Assemblage brain that there was quite a lot around kind of the experience economy, user experience design, as this kind of third paradigm of computing design. And I wanted to really interrogate that whole notion of experience. Now, this has taken me into very sort of strange areas. I'm a big fan of Whitehead, as you might know, is a huge influence on Deleuze. Lots of other people, but he's the philosopher of experience, and I've written one article which is for a journal called AI and Society, which isn't going to be out for quite some time. So I'm hoping to get some more kind of versions out around this. But it's how to use Whitehead's theory of experience, or philosophy experience, within the kind of HCI remit. It's very complicated, but I think I've tapped into some areas that might be interesting, and this would again, involve a lot of kind of research into the kind of engineering aspects of experience design, looking at the technologies behind it, but working that through in a kind of Whiteheadian way. So you can tell that I'm still thinking about it.
Yeah, well, I'm curious. Could you give me an example of what a Whiteheadian experience or analysis of an experience would look like, sort of like what kind of things you're looking for through that lens?
Yeah, okay. Well, one of the interesting things about Whitehead is his idea that space isn't just people in kind of like a grid. So a user isn't in a grid using an object. We would look upon the interaction itself as being more important than the two things in a grid. So where you look at studies in HCI, there's a guy called Paul Dorish who refers a lot to Heidegger, that kind of phenomenal kind of viewpoint of interaction. In a way, this is a bit cloudy between a number of Whitehead books, but Whitehead kicks against that phenomenal approach. So you can completely reinvent the way in which you might study the interaction between a user and a mouse, for example. And this goes right away to sort of some more crazy ideas around panpsychism, the way that it's not just the user experiences the technology, but the technology increasingly experiences the user, for example. There's lots of different things. I don't want to go into too much detail because I've put that article to bed some time ago, and I'd have to get it out and have a read of it. But there's some really interesting things that you can say about user interaction experience design, particularly through using this philosophy. So that's one of the things I'm hoping to develop in the next few months, actually.
No, that sounds cool. That's definitely interesting, and I hope you do pursue it and I'm sure you'll end up with another great book, and maybe we'll be able to talk again.
Oh, great, yeah.
Tony, I really appreciate you spending the time talking, and I really encourage people to pick up your book, because even if you don't have that kind of neuroscience background or critical theory background, both of which I find can be really intimidating, it's just an interesting thing to think about because it's so relevant to what's going on today in our world and the way we use technology.
It was really good talking to you, and thank you very much for your interest in the book. It's very encouraging, and it's a good thing to say about technology that you've contacted me out of the blue over the internet, and here we are.